On February 5, 1999, police received a missing persons report for 21-year-old Linsey Wilson. Officers immediately questioned her husband, who stated that she had left him and the children and ran away with another man. However, the girl's parents were convinced that she would never do such a thing. Then detectives began an investigation, during which they managed to learn the monstrous details of what was happening in this family. Linsey Wilson was born in 1977 in England in a large family. She was the youngest child of Linda and Peter, and she had 5 siblings. The Wilson family was very fond of each other, although they were not particularly close. Linsey was a person who shone both inside and out. She was beautiful, had a dazzling smile and an interesting personality. Her mother described her as an upbeat, cheerful and outgoing girl. She was always friendly, yet shy and reserved. Linsey never got into trouble and was independent. Growing up, she was a typical teenager. She liked to wear makeup, listen to music and spend time with friends. However, there was still one difference from her peers. Linsey dreamed of becoming a recruiter. However, in 1995, at the age of 17, Linsey had to postpone her dream of becoming a recruiter because, being in a relationship with her first boyfriend, she became pregnant and decided to have a baby. The young people got engaged, but during the first few months of her pregnancy, the girl felt she shouldn't continue the relationship and decided to end it. A few weeks later, Linsey met Mitchell Cooey, a man 3 years older than her, who worked as a croupier in a casino. He was not particularly attractive, but his charisma charmed the girl, and she immediately fell in love. Mitchell seemed to be a perfect man. He swamped her with affection and attention. Linsey thought that pregnancy and the beginning of motherhood she would survive without a partner, which at her young age frightened her. But when she met Mitchell, it seemed to her that she had found the perfect partner. A few weeks after their first meeting, they got engaged. And 2 weeks later, on August 1, 1995, they were married. Unlike Linsey, Mitchell had a small family and only his brother attended their wedding. Although the Wilsons were dubious about the hasty marriage, they saw that their daughter was so genuinely happy that they decided to support her. At some point during the wedding reception, the newlyweds began to quarrel. Peter, the bride's father, noticed this situation and was concerned about his son-in-law's behavior, but thought it might be due to his nervousness about making a move 6 weeks after the wedding. Linsey gave birth to her daughter Robin and couldn't be happier. She loved her dearly and was a wonderful, caring mother, but unfortunately not all was well in the young mother's life. Linsey was distraught and told her sister and friend that Mitchell had become aggressive and very controlling towards her. In addition, she learned that he had cheated on her with several women over time. Mitchell began to behave even more aggressively toward Linsey. A year after Robin was born, Linsey learned that she was pregnant again. It seemed unwise for her to have another child in such an unfavorable environment, and she decided not to continue the pregnancy. Upon learning of his wife's action, Mitchell became enraged and severely beat Linsey and left the house. The man would often leave the house and manipulate her after an argument, but would soon return. That time, though, his absence was longer. 5 months later, the couple got back together and he promised that he would change. Each time the couple reconciled after a conflict, the peaceful month phase began. After returning home, Mitchell tried to contain his anger and act like the man Linsey had fallen in love with. He was affectionate and attentive to her and a loving father to Robin. While they were experiencing this new truce, Linsey and Mitchell conceived another child. This time, she decided to keep the pregnancy on track. But Linsey soon realized that her husband was still the same monster. One afternoon, when she was 4 months pregnant, she returned home and found the place in mayhem. Among other things, doors had been broken and a television had been thrown out the window in a fit of rage. Mitchell had destroyed what they had worked so hard to create, and they were homeless because the landlord had decided to evict them. Linsey's loved ones were horrified and claimed that if she had been around, he would have ended her life. However, she did not succumb to her spouse's entreaties and decided to continue her relationship with him. In October 1997, the couple had their first child together, Jack. Linsey was happy with her children, who became her emotional refuge from her husband's increasingly frequent and severe physical abuse and aggression. After an argument in April 1998, Mitchell left again. Linsey thought this was the final breakup, and to keep him from finding her, decided to find another place to move to with the children. She was terrified and feared for her life. At that point, the girl had already reported him to the authorities. Linsey was able to settle down with her 2 children, and after a long time, she reconnected with her family and friends because while she was with Mitchell, he was able to isolate her from those around her. The new house was designed with the children in mind and was full of play and tranquility. There was no doubt that the young woman's only priority was her beloved children. Despite her experience with Mitchell, every time Linsey found herself around him, she began to hesitate. As Jack's first birthday approached, the boy's father began to insist on seeing him, and she finally gave in. Linsey didn't say anything to her parents about it, as they were already tired of the situation. She was probably too ashamed and scared that she would be judged again and want to be estranged. Her attempt to shield them from it didn't last long, and when they found out, they were disappointed and unhappy. They were baffled by Linsey's decision to re-engage in this dangerous relationship. As a result, her parents distanced themselves from her, not only because they were upset, but also to avoid contact with Mitchell. However, one of Linsey's sisters named Paula continued to communicate with her. On October 22, 1998, they went out to dinner together. That day, Linsey asked Paula to help her cut Mitchell out of her life, but she refused, saying it was an earlier case, and in the end Linsey always came back to it. After they left the restaurant, Paula drove her sister to her apartment. Upon arrival, Linsey asked the girl to come into the apartment for coffee. Paula refused at first, as she didn't want to be in the same space as Mitchell. However, she eventually agreed. Both girls were in the kitchen, which connected to the living room, and sitting on the couch, Mitchell stared at Paula so intently that she felt threatened by his behavior. As Linsey walked her sister to her car, she took the opportunity to hand her a piece of paper on which she had written a request to help her get out of there. Paula told her mother about the note, and although they had been worried about the girl since she first told them about Mitchell's attack, they didn't want to get involved. On December 11th, Linsey, along with her 2 children, went to visit her family and spent the day. She told them how excited she was to get ready for the holiday and how happy her children were. On December 24th, Linsey's mother, Linda, tried to contact her as she wanted to see her grandchildren for Christmas, but she received no response. Linsey's parents then decided to go to the couple's home. However, Mitchell himself stopped by his in-laws' house to pick up gifts for the kids and told them that Linsey was getting ready to move. Several days passed, and there was no word from the girl. On February 5, 1999, she was reported missing by a social worker who repeatedly tried to contact her. In connection with the complaint, police interviewed Mitchell, who looked depressed and said that his wife had gone away for Christmas and left him with their 2 children. Police officers were puzzled that he had not reported anything to her relatives. Mitchell denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, but investigators were convinced he was lying. However, there was no evidence against him. Detectives realized that time had been playing against them for over 50 days. No one other than the husband had reported seeing Linsey. Police ordered an excavation in the garden and grounds around the house, but this yielded no leads. Soon after, Mitchell began calling the media and telling his version of what had happened. In various interviews, he presented himself as a father who had been abandoned by his 2 children and was waiting for his wife's return, begging her to come back. Mitchell claimed that Linsey left with an unknown man without even saying goodbye. He also said that he initially thought she would come back for the children, but apparently she no longer cared for them. None of Linsey's loved ones believed this story. They were certain that the girl would never have decided to leave Robin and Jack. Even though Mitchell was the prime suspect in Linsey's disappearance, he was invited to participate in a documentary that was being filmed while investigators were trying to solve the case. The audio-visual team watched the man go about his daily duties, interact with his children and even his wife's relatives, and collected his statements, investigations, and accusations against him. Beyond words, his body language did not suggest that the man was suffering while waiting for his partner to return. Mitchell seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. However, on more than one occasion, he looked disgruntled and gave angry answers to a direct question about whether he had killed the mother of his children. On one such occasion, he shook his head and replied that he was not going to answer the question because it was not necessary. After months of investigation, police discovered that Mitchell had cashed Linsey's social security check by forging her signature. This discovery served to get him arrested on suspicion of murdering his wife, solicitation of grievous bodily harm, and fraud. However, due to a lack of evidence, authorities were only able to prosecute Mitchell for check cashing, and the other charges were dropped. He was released from custody with a sentence of community service. While serving his sentence, Mitchell was videotaped complaining about the work he had to do and making derogatory comments about his wife. Among other things, he stated that he wouldn't urinate on her if she was on fire, a phrase he used toward people he hated. For months after Linsey's disappearance, her father Peter picked up his grandchildren on a weekly basis to continue to communicate with and protect them. At this point, it was inevitable that he would come face to face with the man he felt had taken his daughter from him. Each time, Mitchell invited him in, but Peter refused. In an interview, Linsey's husband mentioned these meetings, saying that in a way he admires Peter for maintaining such a relationship with him. Despite being blamed for his daughter's disappearance, he also predicted that one day his father-in-law would stand at his door and apologize for suspecting him. Peter could not rest easy and took it upon himself to find his daughter. In addition to putting up posters around town after work, he went to different parts of town and dug through the ground looking for her body. All family members were convinced that Linsey had left unwillingly and that her husband had cut her life short. At the same time, Mitchell even claimed to have seen her walking around town or driving a Mercedes, but authorities doubted these accounts. Whenever Mitchell appeared on television, it drew mixed reactions. In general, many people did not empathize with him. The man was uncomfortable, appeared insincere in his pleas for Linsey to come home, and smiled constantly. Mitchell was clearly aware that he was in the crosshairs of the police and claimed on camera that investigators were actually obsessed with him. He asked for the women he was dating. The investigator in charge of the case, Joe Sloan, found that Linsey's diaries contained several appointments she failed to show up for, including one at a hair salon and one at a dentist. In addition, the girl had made an appointment with a divorce attorney with whom she was supposed to meet on December 15, 1998, which she also failed to show up for. Just the day before, on December 14th, Linsey was last seen at the local post office, where she had gone in search of information about a lost welfare check. Joe Sloan was convinced that after running this errand, Linsey returned home, confronted her husband and told him she wanted a divorce, and he responded by taking her life. All evidence pointed to Linsey being the victim of a crime. Detectives then felt they had enough circumstantial evidence to make a case and decided to arrest Mitchell on June 7, 2000. He chose to remain silent, but 36 hours later, on June 8, he finally broke down and confessed to killing Linsey. His confession confirmed the detectives' suspicions. On December 14, 1998, Linsey finally mustered the courage to erase Mitchell from her life. Although she hadn't planned to do so, she told him she had scheduled an appointment with a lawyer because she wanted a divorce. Mitchell flew into a rage, and while the children were upstairs, he grabbed her by the throat, depriving her of breath until she died. Continuing his horrifying account, the suspect said he needed a plan to dispose of the body. The criminal then decided to call his brother, Elliot, who was a butcher, and asked him to help get rid of the corpse. Elliot immediately came to the couple's home, carrying a hacksaw, hammer, screwdriver, and a carpet-cutting knife. The subsequent actions were worthy of a horror movie. Striving to conceal the body, Mitchell dismembered the victim himself, wrapped the remains in bags to hide them from the children, and removed them from the house without arousing suspicion. He then disposed of them in different locations to prevent their discovery. After his confession, Mitchell led the police to the places where he had discarded these remains. Even as he traveled through the city, indicating where parts of his victim's body were located, Mitchell felt comfortable. He knew that representatives of the media were present and continued to smile. Perhaps he enjoyed being the center of attention, regardless of the future that awaited him for such behavior. He became known as the Smiling Killer. Linsey's torso was found in a shallow grave not far from the roller coasters in the amusement park Pleasure Island. Her legs were discovered on the railroad embankment, while her head and hands were never found. Mitchell claimed he had thrown them in a dumpster, which was then taken to a landfill.
The trial of Mitchell began in 2001. By that time, the defendant had changed his admission of guilt to involuntary manslaughter. The prosecutor, Andrew Eddies, argued that Mitchell and Linsey's marriage had been violent. He particularly emphasized the ruthless manner in which the man had ended his wife's life, even though they had children, and his disrespect for her by discarding her remains in various places, including a garbage bin. Andrew Eddies characterized him as a cruel criminal who enjoyed being in the spotlight. One of the witnesses called to testify was Detective Joe Sloan, who shared the prosecution's view that Mitchell took great pleasure in interacting with the media. He mentioned that during the investigation, Mitchell had sent him a Christmas card with a bottle of hair dye and a note advising him to get rid of his gray hair to boost his self-confidence. In delivering the verdict, Judge Brian Levison stated that Mitchell was a malicious cynic who misled the public. He acknowledged that he had assaulted his wife under unintentional circumstances, but what he did afterward was entirely different. The judge elaborated that for 18 months, the defendant engaged in elaborate deception, complaining to the media about his missing wife and berating the police for suspecting him. Finally, in January 2001, 25-year-old Mitchell Quinn was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after at least 17 years. As he left the courtroom, applause could be heard. Mitchell's brother, Elliot, faced a separate trial. The defense argued that he had been presented with a terrible dilemma, claiming that Mitchell's request for assistance in concealing the body was met with a delayed reaction from Elliot. Although Elliot was advised to report to the police by his brother, Mitchell told him he couldn't do so because he would end up in prison and lose his children. Therefore, he ultimately decided to help with the body's disposal. Elliot was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in concealing the body. What do you think of this story? I ask you to write a comment about it and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new horror crime stories. Also ask you to put a like so that the next video will come out sooner.